Montana Territory, 1879. The wind howled low across the plains, dragging dust like a shroud over the road to Fort Benton when the wagon wheels snapped and left her behind. Lorna Tate stood in the cloud of kicked-up dirt, her bonnet hanging loose around her neck, one hand clutching her skirts, the other holding tight to her daughter's small fingers. Her son, Matthew, stood beside her, holding his sister's rag doll like a soldier guarding treasure. The wagon train had kept going. No one looked back. "They will come back," she told them. Her voice cracked before she could finish the lie. They will. But no one came back. She had not planned to be alone with two children on the edge of nowhere. Her husband had died the winter before, his lungs gone to rot from the mine dust in Butte. She had spent her last coins joining a wagon bound for Oregon, hoping for a new start. But the axle snapped, the driver cursed, and the wagon master gave her a choice: stay behind or slow everyone down. "We are not charity," the man had said. The sun dropped low behind the hills, and the cold crept in like fingers under her collar. Lorna gathered what she could from the broken wagon, built a fire from dry brush, and pulled her children close beneath a quilt that smelled of old cedar and grief. She did not sleep. When the first light spilled over the hills, Lorna stood and looked west. "We walk," she said. Matthew, barely 8, said nothing. He only nodded and took his sister's hand. They walked until her boots cracked and her legs trembled. The dry wind burned their lips. By dusk, she knew they would not make it far. Her daughter, Miriam, cried softly but kept walking. When Lorna could not carry her anymore, she dropped to her knees on the hard, packed earth, her arms wrapped around both children. "I am sorry," she whispered. Then came the thunder of hooves. Lorna turned, eyes wide, body tense. A single rider broke through the dust, tall in the saddle, his hat low over his brow, a rifle slung across his back and a long coat whipping behind him. He pulled up hard, the horse snorting, and stared down at her. "Lorna Tate?" he asked. She blinked. "Yes." The cowboy dropped from the saddle in one motion, his boots hitting the ground with finality. He swept off his hat, revealing dark hair and sharp eyes that scanned her, then the children, then the empty road behind them. "Name's Vallen Zade," he said. "You got left behind." Her mouth went dry. "How do you know my name?" "Your cousin in Butte sent word. Said you were heading west. Said you had 2 children and no husband. When I heard the wagon train pass through the canyon without a woman and 2 kids, I knew what happened." "You came all this way." Vallen gave a short nod. "I'd ride through hell to find you." She stared at him, disbelieving. He looked down at the children, his voice low. "You all right?" he asked. Matthew nodded, eyes wide. Miriam clung to her mother's dress. "I have nothing," Lorna said. "No money, no food. The wagon broke. I am not here for payment," he said. "I am here for you." Vallen reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, then a strip of jerky. He handed them to Matthew, who took them in silence and shared with his sister. "We cannot go back," Lorna said, voice raw. "They left us." "We are not going back," Vallen said. "We are going forward. I know a cabin 2 days' ride from here. Belongs to a friend. We rest there, then we figure out the next step." She looked at the children, then at the trail, then at him. "You trust me?" he asked. She hesitated, but the way he looked at her, steady, certain, without pity, made her nod. "I do." He helped her onto the horse first, then lifted each child up to sit with her. When they were all settled, he took the reins and walked beside them through the dusk. They reached the cabin late the second night. Lorna barely kept her eyes open. Vallen carried Miriam in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, and Matthew walked beside him, quiet and tired. The cabin was small but warm. A fire already burned in the hearth. Vallen's friend had left it stocked, just as he said. Blankets, dried food, even a few books. Lorna sat in the corner and watched him move around the space, lighting lamps, stoking the fire, boiling water. He handed her a basin and a cloth. "Get clean," he said gently. "You are safe now." That night, when the children were asleep in the loft, Lorna sat by the fire. Vallen handed her a cup of coffee, strong and black. "You came all this way," she said again, voice low. "I owed your husband once," he said. "Years ago, he saved my life in a mine collapse. Never got the chance to repay it. When I heard he passed and you were out here alone, that was it. I knew what I had to do." She looked at him, eyes soft. "He never told me that." Vallen looked into the fire. "He was a good man. Silence stretched between them, warm and full. "You are a good man, too," she said, so quiet he almost did not hear it. He turned to her. Their eyes met, nothing rushed, nothing forced, just the truth hanging between them. "I will not let anyone leave you behind again," he said. "Not ever." Lorna's throat tightened, her fingers brushed his. He did not pull away. That night, she lay with her children in the loft, listening to the wind outside, the crackle of fire below, and the steady sound of Vallen moving through the cabin, keeping them safe. For the first time in years, she slept without fear. A week passed beneath low-hung clouds and the soft hush of snow settling over the mountain cabin. The wind had changed, carrying the sharp bite of early winter through the pines. Inside, the days moved slow but steady, meals cooked over the hearth, boots drying near the fire, the children learning the rhythm of quiet safety. Lorna had taken to rising before dawn. She'd kneel by the stove, coaxing flame from ash, her fingers red from cold but sure. Vallen would come in from chopping wood, his coat dusted white, and nod without words. Some mornings their eyes would meet in the half-light, and that was enough. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep in the loft, Lorna sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing Miriam's tangled doll hair with a carved comb she'd found in a drawer. Vallen was sharpening his knife by the hearth, the rasp of steel against whetstone steady as breath. She watched him a moment. That blade's near worn thin. He looked up, the fire catching in his eyes. "Carried it since I was 16, ain't let me down yet." "Still," she said, setting the doll aside. "You keep honing that edge like it's the only thing keeping you alive." He set the knife down, wiped the blade clean. "Sometimes it is." She leaned back against the wall, knees drawn up beneath her skirt. "You said you owed my husband," she began, voice careful. "But it feels like you've been carrying more than that." Vallen didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the flames. "Your husband saved me, that's true, dug me out with his bare hands when the mine collapsed. But after that, I left. Couldn't stay in but. Too many ghosts. Rode cattle drives, broke horses, ran freight down into Colorado, kept moving. Running from something," he turned to her, his voice quiet, "from everything." She folded her hands in her lap. "And now," he looked at her like he was seeing something he hadn't understood until now. "Now I'm trying to stop." The silence between them was full, not empty. Lorna's heart beat slow and heavy in her chest, steady as the snow tapping the roof. "Matthew's been asking about school," she said, breaking the hush. "I told him we'd find a town soon, one with a proper teacher, and a mill maybe, somewhere he can make friends." Vallen nodded. "There's a place north of Helena, little settlement near the river, I passed through last spring. Timber work, church, schoolhouse. Folks seemed decent. You think they'd taken a widow with no land or money, they'll take a family with strong backs and steady hands." She met his gaze. "And you'd come with us, if you let me." She didn't answer. Just stood slowly, moved to the hearth and picked up his knife. She turned it over in her hands, careful of the edge. "This blade's done its share of carving through the world," she murmured. "It's time it settled somewhere." Vallen rose and stepped close. "And you," she looked up. "I've done enough losing. I'm ready to keep something." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. His grip was warm, worn, sure. They stood like that for a long while, shadows flickering across the walls, the fire between them not the only thing giving off heat. Later, when the embers had burned low, Lorna whispered as they climbed the loft ladder together, "When spring comes, we'll go north." Vallen's voice was steady behind her. "Together." And when they lay down beside the children, Lorna's hand found his beneath the quilt. She didn't need promises. Not tonight. Only the quiet certainty of a man who had walked through dust and distance and winter to reach her, and stayed. Wind pressed low through the trees as the thaw came slow that year, the snow reluctant to leave the earth it had claimed. Icicles clung to the eaves of the cabin, melting into steady drips that carved shallow grooves in the mud. Lorna stood at the edge of the clearing, apron corners fluttering at her sides, watching Matthew and Miriam trace boot tracks in the slush near the woodpile. A crow called from the ridge. Behind her, Vallen stepped out with a pail, his shirt sleeves rolled and collar open despite the cold. His boots were heavy with damp earth. He set the bucket down near the rain barrel and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Creeks moved higher," he said. Flooded some of the trail east, she glanced over. Will it wash the road out? Not yet, but we'll need to wait another week before it's passable. She nodded and turned her gaze toward the hills again. You've been quiet today, he said. I was thinking about the last spring we had in Butte. Matthew caught frogs in the rain barrel, had to empty the whole thing before we could use it again. She smiled faintly, then let it fade. It feels like someone else's memory now. Vallen stepped beside her, his voice low. You got every right to carry the old days. But you don't owe them your future. She looked down at her hands, the knuckles red from laundry water. It's not just the past I carry, it's the weight of what comes next. Picking a town, starting new, asking 2 children to believe in change again. They already do, he said. They believe in you. Lorna turned her face toward him, eyes steady. And you, what do you believe in? He didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the trees above them, and the children's laughter drifted faint on the air. I believe in what I see, he said finally. And I see a woman who's endured more than most men I've known. I see a mother who didn't break when she had every reason to, and I see a life I want to build if you'll have me in it. She stared at him, not blinking. You mean to stay? I'm not built for passing through anymore. She reached for his hand, fingers cold but firm. Then stay. His palm fit against hers like it had always belonged there. That night, she sat beside him while he oiled the saddle he'd carried across 3 territories. Miriam slept curled against the quilt, and Matthew had taken to carving a length of pine with a penknife Vallen had given him, the beginnings of a small horse taking shape. Helena's still a good choice, Vallen said, his voice low. But I heard of a smaller settlement west of there, near the Bitterroots. Timber camps growing. They just posted for a seamstress and a school assistant. Lorna folded a length of mended fabric, smoothing it across her lap. You think they'd want someone like me? You're not someone like anything, you're you, he met her eyes, and they'd be lucky to have you. She looked toward the children. If we settle there, it won't be a stopover. It'll be for good. That's how I mean it. She didn't speak again until the fire burned low. Then, without looking at him, she said, I don't sleep with fear anymore. He reached across the space and took her hand again. You never have to again. In the early morning, before the sun crested the ridge, she packed away the last of the canned peaches and folded the bedding into the wagon. Matthew loaded the tools. Miriam helped carry the tin cups. Vallen adjusted the harness, his voice quiet as he worked. It's a 3-day ride if the trail holds. We'll stop at the river crossing for the night. Lorna climbed up onto the wagon bench, the reins resting in her lap. She looked at the cabin one last time, the smoke still curling from the chimney, the frost melting from the shutters. You ready? Vallen asked. She glanced at him. I've been ready since the day you found us. He mounted his horse, riding close beside the wagon as they turned toward the trail. The children sat in the back, wrapped in wool and watching the trees thin behind them. As they passed the edge of the clearing, Vallen leaned over, his voice low so only she could hear. I meant what I said, Lorna. I'd ride through hell to find you. She held his gaze, her own voice steady. You already did. They rode on, the road ahead muddy but wide, the air clearing as the morning opened around them. Behind them, the cabin faded into trees. Ahead, the land waited quiet, open, and full of a life not yet lived. By the 3rd day on the trail, the scent of pine deepened and the land began to rise, slow and steady, into the foothills. The wagon creaked across frozen ruts, the wooden wheels groaning as they passed between boulders half swallowed by snowmelt. The children dozed in the back, bundled under wool. Vallen rode ahead, his eyes always sweeping the ridge lines, always listening. Lorna kept the reins steady in her hands, her fingers chapped and raw. The cold wasn't bitter, but it clung to the skin and settled in the joints. Her sleeves were patched, her shoulders sore, but there was a steadiness in her chest that hadn't been there before. Near dusk, they came upon a man leading a mule down a narrow trail that cut across theirs. He was lean, older than Vallen by some years, and walked with a limp that made each step deliberate. Evenin', he called when he saw them. Vallen pulled his horse to a stop and tipped his hat. You from the Bitterroot camp, far side of it. I haul timber down to the mill. Name's Garvey. Lorna pulled the wagon alongside as Vallen dismounted. We're headin' that way, Vallen said. Heard tell they might be needin' hands. Garvey looked them over. You'll find no shortage of work. They're building a second row of cabins near the bend. Womenfolk been asking for a schoolhouse. You bring skill? I so, Lorna said, and I can keep a ledger. Garvey gave a short nod. Then you'll be welcome. They got a foreman named Thatch, bit of a hard man, but honest. Tell him Garvey said you do. They camped off the trail that night, near a stream still running fast from melted snow. Miriam helped gather pine cones while Matthew stacked kindling without being asked. Vallen worked quietly beside them, fencing off a low spot for the mule. Garvey traded them for the last of their dried apples and a sharp hatchet. Lorna knelt by the fire, coaxing warmth from damp wood. When Vallen returned, he handed her a tin plate with a strip of salt pork and beans, warm and smoky. You always carry more than you need, she said, only for those worth carrying it for. She smiled, faint and tired. You think it'll be different there? It won't be easy, he said, lowering himself to the ground beside her, but it'll be ours to shape. She turned her face toward the trees. I haven't owned a thing that lasted in years. You've got 2 children sleeping under your quilt and a man who'd rather walk beside you than ride ahead. The fire popped, sending a spark into the dark. I watched you today, she said, when that man limped past. You shifted your stance like you were ready for trouble. Old habit. From where? He paused before answering. Worked cattle along the Red River once. A man I trusted turned out to be the kind who'd slit your throat for a saddle horse. Been watchin' backs ever since. She looked at him then, really looked, past the calm, past the slow way he moved, to the way his shoulders were always half tensed, like he never quite put down the weight he carried. I won't betray you, she said. He met her gaze and held it. I know. They sat without words after that, the kind of silence that fills rather than empties. When the fire burned low, she stood and reached for his hand. Come lie down, she said. He didn't speak, just followed. They lay close beneath the canvas, the children breathing soft beside them. Her back pressed to his chest, his arm draped over her waist. The wind crept over the hills, but she no longer noticed it. Lorna, he said, voice close to her ear. When we get there, I'd like to build you a porch. She laughed once, soft and startled. A porch, somewhere you can sit with your mending and watch the seasons pass, somewhere you don't have to leave. She placed her hand over his. Then build it. He kissed the back of her neck, slow and sure. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the future as something solid: wood and nail, earth and roof, hands building side by side. A place where no one would be left behind. A place where love didn't need to be spoken to be known. The settlement unfolded gradually as they crested the last ridge, not in grand buildings or flags, but in smoke curling from squat chimneys, a sawmill humming near the river, and 24 cabins scattered among thinning pines. The road turned to packed dirt, pocked with wagon ruts and melted snow. A pair of dogs barked as they passed, then trotted off toward the sound of a hammer. Thatch, the man Garvey had named, met them near the mill with a wary eye and a wire brush of a beard. His coat was patched at the elbows, and the way he stood suggested a man used to giving orders with little patience. You the ones Garvey sent? He asked, voice flat as river stone. Lorna nodded, stepping down from the wagon. Lorna Tate, these are my children. Vallen Zade rides with us. Thatch looked from her to Vallen, then to the wagon bed. We don't take in wanderers unless they mean to stay. We mean to stay, she said. He studied her a moment longer, then gave a short nod. There's a cabin past the ridge. Not much more than a roof and 4 walls, but dry and near the creek. So shop's got a woman quit last month. You can speak with the forewoman there. Lorna lifted her chin. I'll do that. Thatch's gaze shifted to Vallen. You a teamster, ranch hand, freight mostly. Timber when needed. We'll find use for you. By late afternoon, the children were warming by a new hearth while Lorna swept pine needles from the corner of the cabin. The space was small, but had a door that latched, a table sturdy enough to seat 4, and windows that opened to the west. Vallen returned from the mill with an armful of dry goods and a bundle of cloth from the sewing shed. They said you'd need this, he said, setting it on the table. She ran her hand over the fabric, fingers catching on the weave. They offered me the position. Said if I can keep up with the orders, I'll have steady coin by month's end. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. You make anything, you want your name on it, not just the shop's. I plan to. That night, she stitched by lamplight while Vallen carved a small shelf for Miriam's books. Matthew read aloud in a halting voice, tracing each word with his finger. The room smelled of pine resin and warm bread, and when the last candle guttered out, Lorna lay beside Vallen with her hand resting over his chest. "You were right about stopping," she said. He turned his face toward hers in the dark. "You were the one who chose to stay." Spring settled in full by the second week. The thaw gave way to soft ground and the first crocus blooming wild near the creek. Lorna walked the path into town each morning with a tin lunchbox and her thimble tucked into a small cloth pouch. Miriam followed her once, just to watch her hang finished dresses in the window, each one bearing a small tag with her name stitched in tiny, even letters. L. Tate. At the mill, Vallen worked near the ox teams, hauling trimmed pine to the drying lines. He built a workbench outside the cabin, where he began fashioning a porch frame with salvaged boards and a hand plane worn smooth from use. He didn't rush. Each board was measured, shaped, and fit with care. One evening, Lorna stood with her arms folded under her shawl, watching as he drove the final nail into the railing. "You built it just like you said you would," she said. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up at her. "A promise is a kind of shelter." They sat side by side on the porch steps as the sun dropped behind the trees. A pair of loons called from the creek, and somewhere farther off, a fiddle played a slow tune from the bunkhouse. Lorna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded square of muslin. She handed it to him without a word. Inside was a finely stitched handkerchief with his initials in deep blue thread. He turned it over in his hands, thumb brushing the edge. "I wanted to give you something made by my hands, too," she said. He folded it carefully, then leaned close. "You've given me more than you know." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and she kissed him back with the kind of quiet joy that lives only in the hearts of those who have known loss and chosen love anyway. They were married that June in a clearing behind the creek, beneath a canopy of alder and pine. Thatch stood as witness, and the forewoman of the sewing shop offered a bouquet of wildflowers. Miriam wore a crown of braided grass, and Matthew held the rings carved from maple by Vallen's own hands. There was no preacher, only the vows they spoke to each other and the stillness of the mountains keeping watch. Lorna's voice did not shake when she promised to walk beside him through whatever seasons came. Vallen's hand did not tremble when he placed the ring on her finger. They returned to the cabin as a family, not in name only, but in the way they moved through the world together. Years passed, and the porch weathered under many seasons. Children's boots scuffed its boards. Lorna's sewing business grew until she taught others to stitch and measure, to keep accounts and take pride in their work. Vallen built homes for new families, each one better than the last. They grew older, but not apart. In the evenings, they sat side by side, her hand resting over his, their silence full of everything they had built, everything they had become. And through it all, the promise he made that night on the trail held true. She was never left behind again, and he never walked alone. Together, they built a life not out of what they had lost, but out of what they had chosen each other.